The winter gala at Rothfield Manor was meant to be a display of enduring aristocratic power. So instead, it became the exact moment an empire began to die. Inside the private morning room, located just off the Grand Marble Hall, Lady Catherine Montgomery sat in absolute silence. She was officially the Duchess of Rothfield, but the thick leather ledger open on the mahogany desk before her told the real story. She was the sole financial architect keeping the decaying 500-year-old estate from collapsing into dust. Her fountain pen, a heavy gold instrument banded with dark jade, moved across the thick vellum with rhythmic precision. Outside the heavy oak doors, the faint, lively strains of a waltz drifted through the cold corridors. Catherine wore a gown of high, collared heavy gray velvet. It was a garment designed for armor, not for seduction. Then came the knock. Her chief steward, an elderly man whose loyalty belonged entirely to the Montgomery fortune, stepped into the room. He did not look at her directly. The hesitation in his posture carried the weight of a public execution. "Your Grace," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "His Grace, the Duke. He has arrived, and he is not alone." Catherine's hand stopped. The gold nib of her pen pressed hard into the ledger. A single drop of jet, black and gathered, swelled and fell, bleeding into the crisp white page. A tiny fraction of that darkness stained the side of her index finger. It was the only visible evidence of the violence occurring inside her chest. She did not gasp. She did not ask desperate questions. She slowly capped the jade and gold pen, slipped it into the hidden pocket of her velvet skirt, and stood up. Her spine was perfectly straight, aligned with the terrifying discipline of a woman who had been taught that to show pain in public was to surrender power.
"Thank you,"
she said, her voice entirely stripped of warmth. When Catherine stepped out of the study and moved into the grand hall, the atmosphere had already shifted. The orchestra's waltz faltered, the cellos dying out in a discordant scrape of bows. The glittering crowd of 300 aristocrats, people whose very livelihoods depended on the coal lines she owned, parted for her like water pulling back from a freezing shoreline, earth. All eyes were fixed on the grand marble staircase. Edward Harrington, the Duke of Rothfield, was descending the sweeping stone steps, earth. He wore his signature burgundy velvet tailcoat, a garment that projected a foolish, unearned arrogance, but it was not his posture that had stolen the air from the room. It was the woman clinging desperately to his arm, Evelyn Hayes. She was the daughter of the former estate manager, a woman whose soft, round face and wide hazel eyes were currently pitched into perfect mask of fragile innocence. Evelyn wore a delicate pale pink silk gown that looked absurdly thin and entirely inappropriate against the freezing drafts of the Yorkshire manor, earth. But what truly paralyzed the room was the jewelry resting against her flushed collarbone, the Montgomery sapphire. It was a massive diamond-encrusted heirloom that had belonged to Catherine's late mother, a piece of history that represented the very industrial wealth currently keeping the roof over Edward's head. He had given his mistress her mother's legacy. Catherine stopped at the base of the stairs. The silence in the hall was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of an audience waiting for a duchess to break, to scream, to shatter her dignity on the marble floor. Edward stiffened when he saw his wife. His pale gray eyes flickered with a sudden, cowardly panic, but he raised his weak chin, trying to project the authority of a master in his own house. "Catherine," Edward announced, his voice echoing too loudly in the quiet space. Evelyn has suffered a terrible loss in London. She is destitute and unwell. She requires the country air and the protection of this estate to recover her nerves. I have offered her the East Wing. Beside him, Evelyn shrank back, burying her face into the lapel of Edward's burgundy coat. She let out a pathetic, trembling breath, her hand coming up to touch the stolen sapphire at her throat. "Please, your grace," Evelyn whispered, pitching her voice loud enough for the front row of guests to hear. "Do not be cruel. I only needed a night of warmth." It was a masterclass in manipulation. Evelyn was banking on Catherine causing a scene, proving herself to be the cold, heartless tyrant Edward always claimed she was. Catherine looked at the trembling girl. Then she looked at the man she had spent 3 years trying to save from his own financial incompetence. She felt the tiny stain of black ink drying on her finger. She did not yell. She did not raise her hand. "A night of warmth," Catherine repeated. Earth. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the devastating clarity of shattering ice. It sliced through the room, making several nearby lords physically step back. She looked directly into Edward's eyes, watching his false bravado begin to crack under the weight of her stare. "I hope you find it, Edward, because the winter is going to be exceptionally long." She did not demand the necklace back. She did not order the footman to throw them out. Earth. She simply turned her back on her husband, his mistress, and the 300 guests who had come to drink her wine. Catherine Montgomery walked through the parted crowd, her heavy gray velvet sweeping silently across the marble, leaving the Duke of Rothfield standing on his stairs, entirely unaware that the woman walking away was taking the very foundation of his empire with her. The morning after the winter gala arrived with a bitter, biting frost that coated the windows of Rothfield Manor in sheets of white ice. Inside the great house, the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating, awkward tension. The servants moved like ghosts through the grand corridors, keeping their eyes firmly fixed on the floorboards. They knew the hierarchy of the estate had fractured overnight, and none of them wished to be caught in the falling debris. In the private morning room, Lady Catherine Montgomery stood perfectly still. She had not slept. The ashes in the fireplace were entirely cold, mirroring the freezing temperature of the grand, drafty room. Yet, despite the sleepless night, she looked immaculate. She had shed the heavy gray velvet armor of the previous evening and was now dressed for travel. Her outfit was a masterpiece of intimidating tailoring. A crisp, severe traveling suit of dark charcoal wool, paired with a high-collared stark white blouse. Not a single strand of her jet black hair was out of place in its tight, severe twist. She stood before the mahogany desk, methodically arranging the very few items she intended to take with her. She reached out, her fingers pale and steady in the dim morning light. The tiny, faint ghost of a black ink stain still marked her index finger, the only surviving physical evidence of the exact moment her marriage had ended. She picked up the heavy gold fountain pen, banded in dark jade, capped it with a definitive click, and slid it into her leather satchel. Next came the thick black leather ledger. It contained the financial heartbeat of Rothfield Manor, mapping every debt, every asset, and every crumbling stone she had paid to repair. She placed it carefully beside the pen. She was not packing clothes. She was not packing the Rothfield jewels. She was packing her power. Footsteps echoed loudly in the marble hallway outside, lacking the quiet discretion of the estate staff. The heavy oak doors to the morning room swung open. Edward Harrington stood in the doorway, looking far too pleased with himself. The aristocratic hubris that had always masked his deep-seated insecurities was in full bloom. He had abandoned his formal burgundy tailcoat for a relaxed, patterned silk dressing gown, looking every bit the triumphant lord of the manor. Hanging off his arm, wrapped in a lavish fur-lined shawl that Catherine herself had purchased from Paris 2 winters ago, was Evelyn Hayes. Behind them, 2 footmen were struggling to carry a series of cheap, battered trunks up the grand staircase toward the master suite. Edward was not just flaunting his mistress, he was officially installing her in Catherine's place. Edward began, a mocking, superior smile stretching across his weak jawline. He stepped into the room, leaning casually against the back of a leather armchair. I see you are putting on a theatrical display, packing your bags before breakfast. Earth. It is a bit dramatic, Catherine, even for you. Catherine snapped the brass latches of her satchel closed. The sharp metallic sound cut through his smugness like a blade, but she did not look up. I suppose you expect me to beg you to stay, Edward continued, his tone turning cruel. He patted Evelyn's hand where it rested on his arm. Evelyn peeked out from beneath the stolen fur, offering Catherine a wide-eyed look of entirely fabricated pity. I will not beg. If you wish to run off to London and sulk because you cannot bear to share this estate with a woman who actually understands me, then go. But do not think you can punish me with your absence. Evelyn let out a soft, tremulous sigh. Oh, Edward, please don't be harsh with her. It must be so difficult for her grace to realize that money cannot buy a man's heart. It was a calculated, vicious insult designed to provoke a screaming match. Evelyn desperately wanted Catherine to break, to throw something, to prove that she was the hysterical, cold tyrant Edward painted her to be. Catherine finally lifted her gaze, her piercing blue eyes locked onto Evelyn first. She did not glare. She simply looked at the younger woman with the detached, clinical observation of a scientist examining a deeply uninteresting insect, Earth. The absolute absence of anger, jealousy, or even basic acknowledgement made Evelyn's fake, pitying smile falter. The girl instinctively shrank back, pulling the fur shawl tighter around herself. Then Catherine looked at her husband. You have always fundamentally misunderstood the nature of this marriage. Edward, Catherine said. Earth. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of any fluctuation. It was not the voice of a scorned wife. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. You believe I require the title of Duchess to exist in polite society. You believe this crumbling pile of stone is the prize. She picked up her leather satchel by its heavy brass handle. I leave you to your prize. Try to keep the roof from caving in before the spring thaw.
You will be back?
Edward shouted, his smug facade suddenly cracking as she walked toward the door. The sheer indifference in her posture unnerved him.
You are a Montgomery! You have no title without me!
You will come crawling back to Rothfield when you realize London society will shun a woman who abandons her husband. Catherine did not pause her stride. She did not dignify his desperate outburst. With a glance over her shoulder, she walked straight past them, her charcoal wool skirt brushing silently against the doorframe, leaving behind a wake of freezing, untouchable elegance. Out in the biting winter air of the courtyard, a single uncrested black carriage stood waiting on the frost-covered gravel. The breath of the black horses plumed in the freezing morning light. Catherine handed her satchel to the driver, stepped smoothly up into the dark velvet interior, and pulled the door shut. There were no tears. There were no lingering looks at the towering spires of the 500-year-old estate she had spent 3 years trying to save, as the heavy wheels crunched over the ice, carrying her away from the grand gates of Rothfield Manor. Lady Catherine Montgomery sat in perfect silence. She was not a woman running away from a broken home. She was a corporate raider who had just decided to let the failing company burn before returning to buy the ashes. 200 miles south of the freezing Yorkshire moors, the black carriage came to a smooth halt on the cobblestones of Chancery Lane, the heart of London's legal and financial district, beat with a ruthless, calculated rhythm. It was a world that did not care about ancient titles, grand dining halls, or aristocratic bloodlines. It cared only about capital. Lady Catherine Montgomery stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. She had seamlessly shed the muted, defensive tones of a country duchess. Today, she wore a flawlessly tailored navy blue wool business suit, draped in a heavy black overcoat that gave her the imposing, untouchable silhouette of a corporate raider. She walked into the dimly lit, oak-paneled offices of Abernathy, Cole and Partners. Reginald Abernathy, a sharp-featured man of 55 with shrewd eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, stood immediately as she entered the boardroom. He did not offer empty condolences regarding the sudden collapse of her marriage. He was a pragmatist, and he knew exactly who was standing before him. Your Grace. Abernathy greeted, his voice an even, professional murmur. The documents have been prepared according to the ledger you forwarded by courier this morning. Catherine took her seat at the head of the long mahogany table. She placed her black leather satchel on the polished wood and opened the heavy brass latches. She retrieved the thick black ledger, placing it perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. Finally, she drew out the heavy gold fountain pen, banded in dark jade. Let us be precise, Reginald. Catherine said, her voice cool, steady, and stripped of any residual emotion. I want every letter of credit, every joint account, and every standing order associated with Rothfield Manor entirely severed from the Montgomery estate. Abernathy pushed a thick stack of crisp vellum across the table. This notice of severance will freeze their operating accounts instantly. The butcher, the grocer, the stonemasons currently repairing the east wing, and the coal merchants, all of them have been operating under the explicit private guarantee of your personal wealth. He paused, adjusting his spectacles to look at her directly. Without your underwriting, the Duke's personal credit rating will not secure a single loaf of bread in the county. The manor will be entirely without fuel by the end of the week. Catherine uncapped the jade pen. The ghost of the ink stain on her finger had been scrubbed clean. There was no trace of a betrayed wife left in her posture. There was only the cold architecture of a financial siege. A 500-year-old title should provide more than enough warmth for a duke and his new companion. Catherine replied smoothly. The gold nib scratched against the thick paper. One signature. It was a quiet, domestic sound, but it carried the destructive force of a guillotine dropping on an empire. Meanwhile, inside the grand drawing room of Rothfield Manor, the guillotine had not yet struck. A delusional euphoria had taken hold of the estate. Edward Harrington stood by the roaring fireplace swirling a glass of expensive French brandy. Earth. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like the undisputed sovereign of his own domain. There were no ledgers cluttering the tables, no sharp questions about his gambling debts, and no cold, assessing stares from his highly intelligent wife. Evelyn Hayes lounged across a velvet chaise, wearing the stolen Montgomery sapphire over her pale pink silk gown. She held up a catalog of Parisian fashions, her large hazel eyes wide with greedy anticipation. Edward, darling. Evelyn cooed, her soft voice echoing in the cavernous room. Now that the tyrant has fled, we simply must host a proper winter ball, a celebration of our freedom. I will need new silks, of course, something in crimson, and perhaps we could hire an orchestra from London. Edward smiled, a smug, hollow expression of unearned triumph. Whatever you desire, my love, you are the lady of this house now. The county will see how a true duke lives when he is not being suffocated by a merchant's daughter. The heavy oak doors of the drawing room opened, interrupting the fantasy. Thomas Finch, the elderly estate steward, stepped into the room. He looked as gray as the winter sky outside, his hands clutching a stack of telegrams and invoices were visibly trembling. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," Finch said, his voice strained. He completely ignored Evelyn on the chaise. "There is a matter of urgent estate business." Edward sighed, swirling his brandy with an irritated flick of his wrist. "Can this not wait, Finch? I am entertaining." "I am afraid it cannot, sir," Finch replied, stepping closer. "The coal merchants from Leeds, their carts did not arrive this afternoon. Furthermore, the local butcher has refused to deliver the weekly provisions, and the stonemasons have abandoned the scaffolding on the east wing." Edward frowned, his aristocratic pride instantly flaring. "Refused? Nonsense. This family has employed those tradesmen for 3 generations. Send a footman to the village, remind them that I am the Duke of Rothfield, and order them to resume their duties at once." Finch stood perfectly still. The old man swallowed hard, delivering the fatal blow with terrifying clarity. "They know exactly who you are, Your Grace. That is precisely why they refused." Edward's hand froze. The brandy sloshed dangerously close to the rim of his crystal glass. "Explain yourself." "An hour ago, the tradesmen received a formal legal notice from London," Finch said, dropping the stack of unpaid invoices onto a nearby table. "Earth. Lady Catherine's solicitors have formally severed all financial ties. Your joint accounts are frozen. The letters of credit are nullified. You have no funds, Your Grace, and without Her Grace's backing, your name carries 0 credit." Evelyn sat up sharply, her catalog of Parisian silks slipping to the floor. "Edward, what does he mean?" Finch turned his grim eyes toward the roaring fire, knowing it was the last warmth this house would see. "It means, madam, that we have enough coal to last exactly 3 days after that. This castle will begin to freeze." Winter hit Yorkshire not with a flurry, but with a brutal, paralyzing freeze. Rothfield Manor, with its 74 rooms, towering ceilings, and drafty Palladian windows, was designed for grand summer entertaining. To survive December, it required an obscene amount of coal burning in its massive hearths day and night. Earth. By the end of the first week of Catherine's financial freeze, the cellars were entirely empty. The damp seeped into the ancient tapestries lining the corridors. Frost formed intricate, mocking patterns on the inside of the magnificent glass panes. Earth. The estate, once a beacon of aristocratic warmth, had become a sprawling stone icebox. The physical misery of the manor was compounded by the sudden echoing silence. The staff, realizing that the Duke's accounts were frozen and their wages were non-existent, began to desert in droves. The French chef departed first, taking a hired carriage back to London and leaving a curt note on the kitchen table. The footmen, the chambermaids, and the stable hands quietly followed. They packed their meager belongings and slipped out the servants' entrance. Under the cover of night, soon Finch and 3 elderly retainers remained. They stayed not out of respect for Edward, but out of a tragic, misplaced loyalty to the stones of Rothfield itself. With the servants gone and the fires dead, the romance of poverty quickly lost its appeal for Evelyn Hayes. The spun sugar fragility she had used to ensnare Edward melted away, revealing a woman of profound entitlement and petty rage. She hated the cold. She hated the meager meals of boiled root vegetables and hard bread, prepared by a junior scullery maid. Most of all, she hated the realization that the golden cage she thought she had conquered was entirely hollow. "You promised me London society," Evelyn shrieked one evening. She was huddled under a mountain of heavy wool blankets in the drawing room, her breath pluming white in the freezing air. She still wore the stolen Montgomery sapphire at her throat, but without a roaring fire to reflect its brilliance. The heavy diamonds and blue stone only felt like chunks of ice against shivering skin. It was a symbol of immense wealth that she could not actually spend to buy a single log of wood. "You promised me Parisian gowns and a warm hearth," she continued, her voice sharp and ugly.
Look at this place!
"It is a tomb." Edward stood near the dead fireplace. He was still wearing his signature burgundy velvet tailcoat, but it was no longer immaculate. It was wrinkled, smelling of damp wool, and heavily stained with gray ash from his failed attempts to keep the embers alive. "I am doing everything I can, Evelyn," he snapped. His temper, usually masked by aristocratic boredom, was fraying under the relentless stress and the gnawing humiliation of his impotence. "You said you loved me? You said you only needed me, not the title." "I am not a martyr, Edward." She spat back. Her hazel eyes were hard, calculating, and entirely devoid of the weeping vulnerability that had trapped him. "I survived one life of poverty. I will not suffer another because you were too stupid to secure your wife's purse strings before you drove her away." The words hung in the freezing air. It was a brutal, unforgiving truth that shattered the last remnants of their romantic fantasy. Edward stared at the woman he had traded his empire for. For the very first time, he saw her not as a delicate victim in need of saving. He saw a parasite, furious that her host was bleeding dry. Later that night, the temperature dropped so drastically that the pipes in the east wing threatened to freeze and burst. The resulting water damage would destroy the structural integrity of the wing Catherine had just spent thousands of pounds restoring. Edward, driven to absolute desperation, walked into one of the unused guest suites. He looked at a set of antique Chippendale chairs. They were carved from solid mahogany 2 centuries ago, priceless artifacts of the Harrington family legacy. With a heavy, trembling hand, he picked up a heavy iron fireplace poker. The sound of splintering wood echoed violently through the empty, freezing corridors. Edward swung the iron bar down again and again. He was panting, his muscles aching, his hands bleeding from sharp splinters. Thomas Finch stood quietly in the doorway. The old steward watched in silent horror as his master reduced history to kindling. Edward gathered the shattered pieces of mahogany, and carried them to the grate. He struck a match and watched the antique wood catch fire. The flames cast a flickering, pathetic glow over his ash-stained face. Tears of absolute humiliation froze on his cheeks. He was keeping the fire alive for one more night, but as he watched his heritage burn to warn a mistress who despised him, Edward Harrington finally understood that his empire was already dead. The blizzard over the Yorkshire moors was unforgiving, transforming the landscape into a blinding, hostile expanse of white earth, driven by the freezing temperatures of Rothfield Manor and the increasingly shrill, vicious demands of Evelyn Hayes. Edward Harrington did the only thing he had left to do. He rode out into the storm to beg. His journey to the grand financial institutions of Leeds was a miserable, bone-chilling ordeal. Earth. His once immaculate burgundy velvet tailcoat was hidden beneath a heavy riding cloak that smelled faintly of the wood as he had been desperately shoveling from the dead hearths. By the time he handed his exhausted horse to a stable boy outside the Leeds Provincial Bank, Edward's hands were entirely numb, and his aristocratic pride was fracturing under the weight of sheer physical misery. He was ushered into the plush, carpeted office of the bank manager, a Mr. Sterling, who had spent the last 3 years bowing deeply whenever the Duke of Rothfield entered the room. Today, however, there was no bow. There was only a polite, clinical nod. Your Grace, Sterling said, gesturing to a leather chair opposite his wide oak desk. He did not offer tea. This is an unexpected visit given the severe weather. How may the bank assist you? Edward sat down, struggling to keep his teeth from chattering. He attempted to project the effortless superiority that had always defined his interactions with the merchant class. A temporary lack of liquidity, Sterling, Edward said, waving a stiff hand, as if brushing away a minor insect. A misunderstanding with my wife's solicitors has caused a brief delay in the estate's operational funds. I require a bridging loan of £10,000 to cover the winter quarter. The Rothfield name is, of course, my collateral. Sterling folded his hands neatly on his desk. His expression was a mask of professional stone, entirely devoid of the sycophancy Edward was accustomed to. I am afraid that is quite impossible, Your Grace. Edward's pale gray eyes narrowed. The remaining shreds of his ego flared defensively. Impossible. I am the Duke of Rothfield. This bank has held my family's accounts for 4 generations. My title alone spans 5 centuries. And for the last 3 years, those accounts were heavily subsidized by the Montgomery fortune. Sterling replied smoothly, his voice devoid of pity. Without Lady Catherine's explicit underwriting, our risk assessors have evaluated the Rothfield estate. It is not an asset, Your Grace. It is a massive, decaying liability with overwhelming maintenance costs and negligible agricultural yield. The financial market is entirely aware of your current domestic arrangements. We cannot extend credit to a title that has no liquid capital to sustain it. The words struck Edward with the force of a physical blow. He sat frozen in the warm, comfortable office, staring at the banker. For his entire life, Edward had believed his bloodline made him superior. He had believed Catherine was merely a fortunate employee, lucky to purchase his grand name. Sitting in that chair, he finally realized the horrifying truth. The title was a ghost. Catherine had been the blood keeping it alive. Without a single word, the Duke of Rothfield stood up and walked back out into the freezing storm, carrying nothing but the crushing certainty of his own ruin, 200 miles south. The atmosphere could not have been more different. Inside the oak-paneled boardroom of Abernathy, Cole, and partners on Chancery Lane, a warm fire crackled steadily in the hearth. The air smelled of expensive leather, fresh ink, and the quiet hum of absolute power. Lady Catherine Montgomery sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing her impeccably tailored navy blue suit. Her posture was straight, her expression an unreadable mask of elegant restraint. Before her rested the thick black ledger, its pages filled with the meticulous calculations she had made during her final sleepless night at Rothfield. Reginald Abernathy sat adjacent to her, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he reviewed a stack of telegrams that had just arrived from Yorkshire. The financial blockade has yielded exactly the results you projected, Your Grace, Abernathy said, a rare note of professional awe in his tone. The local tradesmen in the north are in an absolute panic. Earth. The butcher, the coal merchants, the stonemasons, they have all realized the Duke cannot pay them. They assume Rothfield Manor is bound for total liquidation by the end of the year. Catherine reached into her satchel and drew out the heavy gold fountain pen banded in dark jade. Panic is a highly motivating emotion, Reginald, she murmured quietly. They want to rid themselves of the risk? Indeed? Abernathy nodded. Several of the larger regional creditors have already attempted to sell the Duke's promissory notes to larger banks, but no one will touch them. Catherine uncapped the jade pen. The gold nib gleamed in the firelight. Where will touch them? She said. Abernathy slid a series of complex legal authorizations across the polished mahogany through a network of 3 anonymous proxy holding companies based here in London. We can offer to buy the Duke's outstanding debts from the local tradesmen and the regional banks at a steep discount, 60 pence to the pound. They will be thrilled to unload the liability. Catherine did not hesitate. The gold nib met the crisp vellum. Her signature flowed elegantly across the page, authorizing the Shadow Syndicate to begin its work. Earth. Buy the agricultural debts inherited from his father. Buy the mortgages on the tenant farms. Buy every unpaid invoice for Evelyn Hayes's Parisian silks. Catherine instructed, her ice blue eyes entirely detached from the cruelty of her actions. By the time the spring arrives, I want to own every single stone of that estate. She capped the pen with a soft, definitive click. She had not shed a single tear since the night she left. She had not plotted a screaming confrontation. She had simply stepped out of the golden cage, locked the door from the outside, and bought the key. The relentless freezing temperatures inside Rothfield Manor were slowly stripping away the last facades of aristocratic dignity. Evelyn Hayes had given her final ultimatum, shivering beneath a pile of heavy wool blankets. She told Edward that if he could not prove his status to the county, she would pack her trunks and leave him to freeze alone. Driven by a toxic mixture of bruised pride and the desperate need to placate his increasingly vicious mistress, Edward Harrington committed an act of absolute sacrilege. He rode through the biting wind to a discreet pawnbroker in the narrow back alleys of York. He did not introduce himself. He simply slid his hand out from beneath his ash-stained riding cloak and placed the Harrington's signet ring on the scratched wooden counter. Earth. It was a heavy, solid gold crest that had been passed from father to son since the reign of Henry VIII. He traded 500 years of bloodline history for a handful of cash. The humiliating sum was barely enough to hire a modest string quartet from the city, purchase 36 bottles of mediocre champagne, and light the grand ballroom with hundreds of wax candles. Invitations pressed with the family crest were hastily dispatched to 150 of the most prominent families in Yorkshire and London. Edward was determined to host a grand winter ball. He believed that a magnificent showing would convince high society that the Harringtons were still powerful, thereby magically restoring his ruined credit. The night of the ball arrived alongside a bitter, howling snowstorm. Upstairs in the freezing master suite, Evelyn spent hours preparing. She wore a scandalous, deeply cut gown of crimson silk. It had been ordered from Paris on credit. Weeks ago, credit she now knew Edward could not actually pay. She stood before the frost-edged vanity mirrors, pinching her cheeks to bring out the color, adjusting the paste jewels at her throat. Tonight, she was ready to step out of the shadows and play the conquering queen of the county. At 8 o'clock, the hired musicians struck up a lively, sweeping waltz. Earth. Edward stood at the foot of the grand marble staircase. He was wearing his finest evening tailcoat, though the cuffs were slightly frayed. He offered his arm to Evelyn as she descended, her crimson silk trailing like spilled blood against the pale stone. The ballroom was blazing with light, the chandeliers reflecting brilliantly off the polished oak floors. They took their positions near the entrance, waiting to receive their guests. By 9 o'clock, the long gravel driveway remained utterly empty. Earth. By 10 o'clock, the musicians had stopped playing. They rested their instruments in their laps, exchanging uncomfortable, pitying glances with one another. Earth. The hundreds of wax candles began to burn down, casting long, mocking shadows across the vast, empty room. The lavish buffet of roasted meats and imported winter fruits sat untouched, slowly congealing in the agonizing chill of the drafty hall. No one had come. Not the Earl of Clarendon, not the local magistrates, not even the minor baronets who used to beg for an invitation to the famous Rothfield autumn hunts. The social boycott was absolute, deafening, and devastating. 200 miles away in London, Lady Catherine Montgomery had not needed to send a single letter. She had not needed to utter a single word of instruction or demand loyalty from her peers. High society understood the brutal, unforgiving math of power. To attend the Duke's Phantom Ball was to legitimize his grifting mistress. More importantly, it was a direct insult to the Cavendish and Montgomery fortunes. Society had quietly, unanimously chosen its side. Earth. Edward Harrington had been violently ostracized from his own world. Evelyn stood in the center of the empty ballroom. The vibrant crimson silk of her gown looked absurd, like a tragic theatrical costume on a stage where the audience had refused to take their seats. Her face contorted. Earth. The soft, wide-eyed innocence vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "They are laughing at us," she whispered. Her voice trembled not with sorrow, but with venom. "They are sitting in their warm, rich estates, drinking their fine wines, and laughing at you, Edward." "Evelyn, please," Edward begged, stepping forward to touch her arm. His pride was utterly broken. His pale gray eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "It is the snow. The roads must be impossible to navigate."
Do not insult my intelligence.
She screamed, slapping his hand away with startling violence. The slap echoed sharply off the gilded ceiling.
It is her.
"It is your cold, calculating wife. She owns them just as she owned you.
You are a joke.
Edward stood paralyzed, the words slicing through the last of his delusions. He had thrown away a brilliant, fiercely capable woman for this shallow, screaming creature, and the entire world was watching him drown before Edward could draw breath to defend himself. A sound cut through the bitter silence of the manor. The heavy, metallic thud of the grand brass knocker echoed through the massive front doors. Someone had braved the storm. The heavy, metallic thud of the grand brass knocker echoed through the silent, freezing halls of Rothfield Manor. Thomas Finch, moving with the painful slowness of an old man whose bones ached from the damp cold, crossed the marble foyer to open the massive double doors. A gust of biting winter wind howled into the manor, bringing with it a single figure. It was Lord Arthur Sterling. Sterling was a ruthlessly successful industrial magnate who had recently purchased a neighboring estate. He was everything Edward was not: self-made, obscenely wealthy, and entirely devoid of aristocratic sentimentality. He was a predator who bought failing businesses and stripped them for parts. Sterling handed his heavy, fur-lined cashmere coat to the shivering Finch and strolled into the ballroom. His dark, assessing eyes swept over the tragic scene. He took in the untouched buffet, the miserable hired musicians, the desperate Duke, and the furious Mistress standing in her absurd crimson silk gown. A slow, cruel smile spread across Sterling's face. "Forgive my tardiness, Harrington," Sterling said, his deep voice booming effortlessly in the empty space. "My carriage lost a wheel in the snowdrift. But I see I haven't missed the festivities. In fact, it appears I am the festivities." Edward swallowed his profound humiliation, forcing a stiff, aristocratic bow. His frayed burgundy tailcoat felt suddenly paper thin. "Lord Sterling, we are delighted you could make it. The severe weather seems to have deterred our other guests." "Yes, the weather," Sterling replied dryly. His gaze shifted entirely to Evelyn. He walked toward her, his eyes evaluating her with the exact same calculation he used to appraise a lucrative coal mine. "And this vision in crimson must be the famous Miss Hayes." Sterling murmured, "The county speaks of little else." Evelyn's demeanor shifted with whiplash inducing speed. The shrieking, furious harpy of 5 minutes ago vanished entirely. She lowered her eyelashes, her lips curving into a soft, vulnerable smile. She recognized power. More importantly, she smelled liquid capital. Sterling's waistcoat watch chain was solid gold. His diamond stick pin caught the flickering candlelight. He carried an aura of untouchable financial security that Edward had entirely lost. "You flatter me, my lord," Evelyn whispered, extending a gloved hand. Sterling took it, bowing over it, his lips brushing the fabric, just a fraction longer than polite society dictated. Edward stood frozen, watching the blatant seduction unfold in his own ballroom. "I must confess, Harrington," Sterling said smoothly, turning slightly back to Edward, though he kept Evelyn's hand in his. "I did not brave the storm merely for a waltz. I came with a business proposition. I require timber for my new railway contracts. I am prepared to offer you a sum for the eastern woodlands, a fraction of their value, of course, given your current desperation." Edward's face paled. Selling the ancient timber was the ultimate admission of defeat. It was an amputation to save a rotting corpse. "The woodlands are not for sale, Sterling. Everything is for sale, Harrington, when the coal runs out." Sterling countered lightly. He did not wait for Edward to argue. He turned his attention entirely back to Evelyn. "Miss Hayes, since the Duke is too proud to admit his ship is sinking, Perhaps you would do me the honor of a dance. The musicians are being paid for, after all. Edward opened his mouth to order Sterling out of his home. But before he could draw a breath, Evelyn stepped smoothly into Sterling's arms. "I would be delighted, my lord," she said softly, her hazel eyes locked onto his. The hired musicians struck up a mournful waltz. Edward Harrington retreated into the shadows of the freezing ballroom. He stood utterly alone, watching the woman he had sacrificed his life for dance away in the arms of his rival. In that bitter moment, he finally understood that Catherine had taken his wealth, but Evelyn was about to take whatever was left of his dignity. The final illusion collapsed the following morning. Edward had been awake since dawn, pacing his freezing study in a desperate attempt to draft letters to distant relatives. He emerged into the hallway to find two burly men in rough wool coats hauling Evelyn's heavy trunks toward the front door. His blood ran cold. He rushed up the grand staircase, throwing open the doors to the master suite. The room was a disaster of discarded clothing. Standing by the frost-edged vanity, wrapped in a luxurious Russian sable coat that Edward certainly had not paid for, was Evelyn. She was calmly stuffing the last of the Montgomery silver, a set of priceless Queen Anne candlesticks, into a velvet satchel.
"What are you doing?"
Edward's voice was a ragged, hollow rasp. Evelyn snapped the satchel shut. She turned to face him, her beautiful features set in a mask of supreme, chilling indifference. "I am leaving, Edward. Arthur's carriage is waiting for me at the bottom of the drive." Edward took a staggering step forward, his hands trembling. "You cannot be serious. After everything I have done for you, after everything I sacrificed." Evelyn let out a short, brutal laugh. The sound was entirely devoid of warmth. "Oh, Edward, do stop playing the tragic poet. You sacrificed nothing but your own ego. You wanted a pet to adore you because your wife was too intelligent to flatter your delusions." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Well, your pet is starving, and this cage is freezing."
I threw my wife out of this house for you.
He shouted, the echo bouncing off the stripped, bare walls.
You threw her out.
"Because you were intimidated by her?" Evelyn sneered. "And what did your grand defiance buy me?"
Frostbite?
"Arthur is taking me to London. He understands the value of a beautiful woman, and more importantly, he can afford the upkeep." Edward reached out, grabbing her arm with desperate, pathetic force.
You are stealing my family's silver!
Evelyn looked down at his hand, then back up to his face with a look of utter, devastating pity. "Consider it payment for services rendered, Edward. Besides, if you check the invoices from the dressmakers, you will find you owe them nearly £2,000 in my name. The silver will barely cover the interest. Now let me go, or I will scream for Arthur's men to come up here and break your jaw." Slowly, Edward's fingers uncurled. The fight drained out of him, leaving only a hollow, echoing void. He stepped back, watching as the woman who had been his childhood fantasy, his grand rebellion, walked past him without a second glance. He followed her down the stairs like a ghost. He stood in the open doorway, the biting winter wind whipping his unkempt blonde hair, and watched Evelyn haze climb into Lord Sterling's heated carriage. Sterling, sitting inside, tipped his silk top hat to Edward in a gesture of absolute triumphant mockery. As the carriage rolled down the drive, disappearing into the blinding white snow, Edward Harrington stood alone in the freezing ruins of his empire, Earth. He had chosen the whisper in the dark over the iron will of his Duchess, and now The darkness had come to collect. Rothfield Manor had ceased to be a home. It had become a sprawling, frozen mausoleum holding the corpse of a 500-year-old dynasty. In the long, agonizing weeks following Evelyn Hayes's departure, the great house fell into an absolute feral state of decay. Earth, the devastating winter, had shown no mercy, and without Catherine's financial backing to purchase coal, the cold had won. Edward Harrington lived in exactly 2 rooms on the ground floor, having sealed off the rest of the 74 chambers to trap whatever meager warmth remained. He looked 10 years older than his 38 years. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones jutting out sharply beneath pale, hollow skin. His eyes, once a confident, aristocratic gray, were now bloodshot and haunted by the deafening silence of the empty corridors. He was still wearing his signature burgundy velvet tailcoat, but it was no longer a symbol of his arrogant vanity. The velvet was permanently stained with dark wood. Ash, the elbows were worn thin, and the fine silk lapels were frayed and dull. He was kneeling before the hearth in the ruined drawing room, using a heavy iron poker to smash a beautifully carved mahogany side table into splintered fragments. He fed the shattered wood into the dying embers, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He was a duke reducing his own heritage to kindling just to survive the night. The heavy, dragging footsteps of Thomas Finch echoed from the hallway. The old steward appeared in the doorway, wearing a thick woolen scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. Finch looked completely exhausted, carrying a small silver tray that seemed absurdly out of place in the ruined room. Resting on the tray was a thick vellum envelope. It bore a heavy, dark red wax seal. "The post rider from York just arrived, Your Grace," Finch said, his voice a raspy whisper. "It is from London, from the solicitors on Chancery Lane." Edward dropped the iron poker. It clattered loudly against the stone hearth. His hands were trembling, covered in dirt and soot. As he reached for the pristine white envelope, he broke the red wax seal and unfolded the thick, stiff paper. The legal script was dense, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. It was a formal notice of foreclosure and summons issued by Abernathy, Cole, and Partners on behalf of an anonymous London proxy syndicate. The document meticulously detailed his utter ruin. The syndicate had purchased the mortgages on the tenant farms. They had bought the promissory notes from the local butchers, the coal merchants, and the stonemasons. They had acquired the ancient agricultural debts inherited from his father. The principal sums were entirely due. The final paragraph was a lethal ultimatum. Edward was ordered to appear at the boardroom of Abernathy, Cole, and Partners on Chancery Lane at precisely 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon to surrender the estate's remaining assets. If he failed to appear, the solicitors would immediately petition the royal courts. Warrants would be issued, the bailiffs would arrive in Yorkshire, and the Duke of Rothfield would be publicly arrested and transferred to Fleet Prison for outstanding and unpayable debts. The paper slipped from Edward's suit, stained fingers fluttering to the icy floorboards. Fleet Prison. The very name sent a paralyzing shock of pure terror through his chest. It was a squalid, miserable debtor's prison where men died of disease and exposure forgotten by society. Earth. The ultimate humiliation for a man who had demanded total respect simply because of his bloodline. "Pack a bag, Finch," Edward whispered, his voice cracking violently. "I must go to London." 2 days later, the Duke of Rothfield began the most degrading journey of his life, Earth. There were no magnificent black horses waiting in the courtyard. There was no polished carriage with the family crest. The stables were entirely empty. Edward had to walk. He stepped out of the grand iron gates of his ancestral home and began the 3-mile trek to the local village train station. The winter snow was beginning to melt, turning the country roads into a thick, freezing sludge. By the time he reached the station, his fine leather boots were caked in heavy mud. The hem of his ash-stained burgundy coat was soaked with dirty water. He did not have the funds for a private compartment. With the last few crumpled banknotes he had scavenged from an old desk drawer, Edward purchased a third-class ticket. He sat on a hard wooden bench in a crowded, drafty carriage, surrounded by laborers and merchants. The smell of cheap tobacco and burning coal filled the air. No one recognized him. No one bowed. Without his wealth, he was just another tired, desperate man wearing a ruined coat. During the long, rattling journey south, the last surviving fragments of Edward's aristocratic arrogance were completely crushed under the weight of his fear. He stared out the smudged window at the passing countryside, compulsively rehearsing his pathetic pleas. Earth. He would beg the faceless London bankers for an extension. He would promise to sell the remaining artwork, the library, the hunting rights. He would offer them anything to avoid the horrifying disgrace of Fleet Prison. He was entirely ready to humiliate himself. When the train finally arrived in London, a cold, gray drizzle was falling over the city. Edward walked the busy streets toward the financial district, clutching his damp coat around himself. He reached the imposing darkwood facade of Abernathy, Cole, and Partners. He stood before the heavy brass door handles, his heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He took shallow, shaking breath, pushed the heavy oak doors open, and walked inside, fully prepared to face a firing squad of ruthless, anonymous creditors. He had absolutely no idea that the executioner waiting for him in the boardroom was wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. The junior clerk pulled open the massive, brass-studded oak doors to the senior partner's boardroom. Edward Harrington, the Duke of Rothfield, stepped across the threshold. He looked like a beggar trespassing in a palace. The thick Persian rug absorbed the sound of his muddy, ruined boots. The air in the room was warm, smelling of expensive beeswax polish, old legal texts, and the quiet, heavy atmosphere of absolute power. Edward clutched his damp, ash-stained hat to his chest. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs. He prepared himself to face a tribunal of merciless, gray-haired London bankers. He rehearsed his pathetic apologies one final time, ready to humiliate himself completely to avoid the horrors of Fleet Prison. He looked down the length of the massive mahogany table at the far end. Seated in a high, backed leather chair was Mr. Reginald Abernathy. But Abernathy was not presiding over the meeting. He was sitting slightly to the side, arranging a neat stack of vellum documents. It was the figure seated at the absolute head of the table that made the blood freeze in Edward's veins. Lady Catherine Montgomery, she did not look like a scorned, heartbroken wife. Earth. She looked like a sovereign presiding over a conquered territory. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue wool suit, the sharp lines of the garment projecting an aura of untouchable corporate dominance. Her jet black hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless twist. Her piercing ice blue locked onto his. There was no anger in her gaze. There was no malice, no lingering sorrow, and certainly no love. She looked at the Duke of Rothfield with the cold, detached calculation of a senior auditor viewing a thoroughly bankrupt ledger. Catherine, Edward whispered. The words stumbled out of his dry throat, weak and confused. He looked wildly around the vast, empty boardroom. The panic in his chest mutated into a desperate, frantic confusion. Had they summoned her too? Was she here to beg the bankers alongside him? What are you doing here? Edward asked, taking a hesitant step forward. Where are the creditors? Catherine did not answer. She merely gestured gracefully toward the single, empty wooden chair positioned at the opposite end of the long table. Please sit down, Edward, Catherine said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, echoing in the quiet room with the flat, chilled acoustics of a bank vault. You look exhausted. I demand to know what is happening. Edward snapped, a sudden, pathetic flicker of his old aristocratic arrogance trying to ignite through his fear. He turned to the solicitor. Abernathy! I was summoned by the syndicate, holding my notes of debt.
I demand to see them.
And so you shall, your grace. Abernathy replied smoothly, not bothering to rise from his seat. The solicitor pushed his wire, rimmed spectacles up the bridge of his nose and gestured a hand toward the head of the table. Allow me to formally introduce you to the sole proprietor and primary underwriter of the proxy syndicate, your exclusive creditor. Edward's knees gave out. The physical strength completely evaporated from his legs. He collapsed into the wooden chair, his hands hitting the mahogany table to steady himself as the room seemed to violently tilt. He stared at his wife. The horrifying reality of the trap he had walked into began to crush the breath from his lungs. You, Edward breathed, his face draining of all color until he looked like a wax corpse. You bought my debts. Catherine reached down to the floor and lifted her black leather satchel. The brass latches clicked sharply in the silent room. She withdrew the thick black ledger and placed it squarely on the table. I am a pragmatist, Edward, Catherine replied, her tone perfectly conversational. I recognized a heavily devalued, poorly managed asset, and I acquired it. You planned this. Edward's voice shook with a toxic, paralyzing mixture of awe and absolute terror. From the day you left, you planned to destroy me. Do not flatter yourself with dramatic delusions, Catherine corrected sharply. Her blue eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. I plan to secure my investment. She rested her pale hands on the black ledger. I spent 3 years and thousands of pounds of my family's money fixing your crumbling roof, restoring your exhausted soil, and repairing your tarnished name. Did you truly believe I would walk away weeping and simply let a village grifter and your own staggering incompetence destroy my life's work? Edward stared at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He had traded this terrifying, brilliant woman for the shallow flattery of a mistress who had already abandoned him. He was the architect of his own slaughter. Catherine opened the ledger and slid a thick stack of invoices across the polished wood. I bought the mortgages on your tenant farms, Earth. I bought the promissory notes from the coal merchants who let you freeze. I even bought the unpaid Parisian silk invoices accumulated by Miss Hayes. Catherine reached into her satchel one final time. She withdrew the heavy gold fountain pen, banded in dark jade, the same pen she had used on the night of the winter gala when a single drop of black ink had signaled the end of his empire. She set the gold pen down on top of a fresh, heavily inked legal document.
And now, Edward?
The Iron Duchess whispered softly, the lethal trap finally snapping shut. I am calling in the debt. The heavy silence in the boardroom of Abernathy, Cole, and Partners was broken only by the steady, indifferent ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Earth. Edward Harrington stared at the thick vellum document resting on the polished mahogany table. The legal script was dense and unforgiving. It was a deed of relinquishment, a formal, irrevocable transfer of Rothfield Manor, its tenant farms, its ancient woodlands, and its 500-year-old title privileges to the sole ownership of the proxy syndicate, a syndicate entirely controlled by the woman sitting across from him. You have two choices today, Catherine said. She leaned forward slightly. The afternoon light filtered through the tall London windows, catching the sharp, uncompromising angles of her face. She looked magnificent, untouchable. You will sign this document legally, transferring the entirety of the Rothfield estate to my name in perpetuity to settle your overwhelming debt, Earth. In exchange, I will grant you a modest annuity of £500 a year. It is enough to live quietly in a small, obscure cottage in Cornwall. You will never set foot in Yorkshire again. Edward's pale gray eyes widened in sheer, paralyzing horror. And if I refuse? If you refuse, Catherine replied softly, the lethal trap finally snapping shut. Minster, Earth. Abernathy will walk down to the royal courts of justice and file for immediate bankruptcy. The bailiffs will be summoned. Your remaining shattered furniture will be auctioned on the lawn. You will be stripped of your peerage privileges, and you will be escorted to Fleet Prison by nightfall. The air in the room felt entirely depleted. Edward looked at Mr. Earth. Abernathy desperately searching for a flicker of professional mercy. The solicitor's face was a mask of cold stone. There were no allies left in this room. There were no sycophants to call him your grace and pretend his foolishness was genius. He was cornered, stripped of his illusions, and facing the brutal clinical machinery of absolute financial power. You cannot do this, Catherine, Edward whispered. His voice cracked, tears of profound humiliation spilling over his ash-stained cheeks. Westford is my birthright. It is the soil of my ancestors. You cannot simply steal it. I am not stealing it, Edward. I am buying it at a steep discount. Catherine corrected, her tone devoid of any triumphant gloating. It was pure, icy pragmatism. Your ancestors may have conquered that soil, but you neglected it. You pawned your birthright. The moment you decided a village grifter was worth more than the survival of your legacy. I am simply closing the ledger. With a suffocating sob that he could no longer suppress, Edward reached across the table. His filthy, trembling fingers picked up the heavy gold fountain pen banded in dark jade. The scratching of the gold nib against the thick vellum sounded deafening in the quiet room. He signed his name, Edward William Harrington. He signed away the manor, the lands, the art, the library, and the very ground he had walked on since childhood. Abernathy swiftly pulled the document away, applying a heavy red wax seal to make the transfer legally binding and irrevocable. Edward slumped back in his wooden chair, a hollow, broken shell of a man. You have your prize, Catherine, he rasped bitterly. I hope the cold, empty halls of Rothfield keep you warm at night. Catherine stood up, gracefully smoothing the front of her navy blue suit. She looked down at him with a strange, detached pity. The halls will not be empty, Edward. They will be functional, and as for warmth, that is a luxury for those who can afford coal. I can afford it. She picked up her black leather satchel, turning toward the door, but she paused, looking back over her shoulder. Oh, and Edward, since you traded your entire empire for the profound love of Miss Evelyn Hayes, you might be interested in a telegram Mistress Abernathy received from his associates in Paris this morning. Edward's head snapped up. A pathetic, desperate flicker of hope sparked in his bloodshot eyes. Lord Sterling. He took Evelyn to Paris. He did. Miss Abernathy interjected, a thin, ruthless smile touching his lips. And once the timber contracts he forced you to sign were safely filed, Lord Sterling found himself thoroughly bored with Miss Hayes and her constant demands for Parisian silks. He evicted her from his townhouse and left her at a very cheap, unheated boarding house in Montmartre. Catherine watched the last shred of Edward's soul shatter earth. It seems Miss Hayes vastly overestimated her market value, Catherine said quietly. She sent a frantic telegram to my solicitors yesterday, begging to be put in contact with you. She said she made a terrible mistake and wished to come home to her Duke. The breath rushed out of Edward's lungs. Earth, the grand, tragic romance that had cost him his dukedom, was nothing more than a cheap transactional farce, and he was the only one foolish enough to have paid full price. I assume you did not give her my direction, Edward mumbled, staring blankly at the mahogany table. I told her that the Duke of Rothfield was entirely bankrupt, facing Fleet prison, and had absolutely no funds to offer. Abernathy replied, adjusting his spectacles. She did not reply. Catherine opened the heavy oak doors. Your first annuity check is waiting with the junior clerk downstairs. Edward, do not return to Yorkshire. Goodbye. The heavy doors clicked shut. Edward Harrington was left entirely alone with his profound ruin, an envelope of meager cash, and the devastating realization that the woman he threw away was the only true sovereign he had ever known. 4 months later, spring arrived in Yorkshire with a brilliant, defiant burst of green, melting the last remnants of the bitter winter that had nearly killed Rothfield Manor. A magnificent black carriage bearing the Montgomery crest rather than the Harrington coat of arms crunched smoothly along the freshly raked gravel of the main drive. Lady Catherine Montgomery stepped down before the grand Palladian steps, Earth. She wore a flawless traveling gown of deep emerald silk, projecting an aura of untouchable intellectual grace. Thomas Finch, the old steward, stood waiting by the open double doors. He looked healthier and taller than he had in months. Earth. The skeleton crew of freezing servants had been replaced by a fully staffed, well-paid and meticulously organized household. The dust sheets were gone. The grand chandeliers gleamed. The fires were roaring in every hearth, sending warm, comforting heat through the ancient stone corridors. Finch bowed deeply, a gesture of profound, earned respect. Welcome home, Your Grace. Catherine looked up at the towering stone facade. It was no longer a crumbling cage. It was no longer a symbol of her husband's arrogant entitlement. It was a fortress she had bought and paid for with her own brilliant mind. Thank you, Finch, Catherine murmured, stepping over the threshold into the warm, glittering foyer. She did not look back at the gates. She did not need to. The Iron Duchess had returned, and this time the empire belonged entirely to her.